In this video I'm going to demonstrate how to rebuild a FujiMAC diaphragm air pump. So this particular air pump is a FujiMAC 80R2 and the procedure is the same for all of them, although with the larger double pump units, the MAC 150 and the MAC 200, there are effectively two of these pumps under one housing, so it's the same procedure, but you need to replace 4 sets of diaphragms and chamber blocks instead of just the 2 that we're going to do here. So it's always a good idea to start off a rebuild with a fresh air filter. The air filter is under this plastic housing on the top of the pump. It's held on by a single Phillips screw. And the air filter cover makes a handy collector for the screws that you're going to remove to rebuild this. So around the base of the pump there are 4 bolts, and depending on where you are in the world, they're either 8mm or 5/16, and they also have a Phillips head, so you can quite often remove all 4 with just a Phillips screwdriver, or start them as I am with a wrench and spin them off with a screwdriver. And a lot of maintenance providers will just use a cordless drill with a nut driver attachment to do this, which speeds everything up. The biggest part of this job is winding the screws out. So once the 4 screws are out, sometimes the pump housing will seal to the gasket, and it's easy to fix that just by wrapping the outlet neck with the butt end of a screwdriver to break the seal, but generally they just lift right off. So there's the guts of the pump underneath. So this is the chamber block, or compression chamber, or valve assembly, depending on what you want to call it. And this is the bit that allows air in and out of the pump to produce air pressure. There's one on either side, and then the white is the actual diaphragm that we're going to replace. It's the only moving part, really, other than the magnet that shuttles back and forth. I should say it's the only wear item, really, on the pump. So we need to get to that and replace it. So the chamber block is held on by 4 Phillips screws. And some manufacturers have a separate 90-degree elbow that you have to remove that directs air from the chamber block down into the base of the pump. This FujiMAC air pump does not have that. It's all one unit, so it actually saves a step during the rebuild process. I'm doing the side without the wiring first, and the other side is exactly the same procedure, but you have to contend with the electrical wires. So I'll show that in a minute. 4 screws are out, so you can just pop this chamber block out. So that's the valve assembly. And underneath is the diaphragm. So the diaphragm is held on by a single nut with a washer behind it, and it's 7/32 or 5.5 mil. If you're a maintenance provider and you're doing this a lot, FujiMAC, your distributor, will actually sell you a toolkit to do this job. Otherwise, a 7/32 socket is not hard to find. I like to turn this on its side when I do this part. There's a possibility you can drop that nut or washer down into the base of the pump. And that's not the end of the world. You can shake it back out, but it does add a step that you can avoid. So diaphragm and chamber block are out. So that's the magnet. See, it always wants to stick to one side or the other. And it has 2 positions depending on where the diaphragm is on the other side. So to put this back together, I like to pull it out so the shaft on the magnet that we're going to thread the nut back onto is all the way out. So the diaphragm has a couple of parts that stick out, and they fit into 2 little notches on the frame of the pump here. So you thread the shaft from the magnet through the holes. Put that backwards. And you don't actually need to align anything at this point. You just need to put the washer and the nut back on. And once again, I'm going to lie it on its side so I don't drop anything down into the base of the pump. Tighten that up. So now chamber block goes on, push the neck down into the rubber boot, and now you have to line everything up. So you put those two little protrusions on the diaphragm into the notches on the frame of the pump. And then the chamber block will clip into place. And if you've got everything right, there's no gaps. Everything is sealed up quite tight on the top here. So I like to hold it with my hand while I put all the screws back in. If I remove my hand before the screws are in, and a couple of them at least are secured, the opposite diaphragm wants to push everything apart again, and you have to line it up a second time. So I keep my free hand holding everything together until I have at least a couple of the screws in. So I'm snugging them up, and then I'll go around one more time in an X pattern just to tighten them. And now everything is secured. I can take my hand off. So I go crisscross to give one more turn to the screws. That side's done. So now we turn the pump around, and the only difference really here is that you have to contend with the electrical wires. So there's three wires. The green one is not an issue, that's the ground. The white is the neutral, and the black is power. So you'll see the black is tucked into a notch here on the side of the diaphragm, so you just pull it out. And I like to just wrap it around the side of the coil so it's out of the way. And then the neutral is tucked into a notch on the top of the chamber block and another notch on the side on the diaphragm. Same thing, I can just pull that out of the way. And now you can pull those 4 screws out, and it's the same process as the other side of the pump. And I'm still putting everything back into the air filter cover to make sure I don't lose anything. If you're a maintenance provider, you're doing this regularly, you might want to think about keeping a refurbished pump in your truck. And then when you go to a customer and they put a dead pump, you can swap it out. And then you can do this job at your leisure on your desk or in your service truck, and you don't have to worry about losing parts in the middle of the night in someone's backyard. So, chamber block off. Turn it on its side, pull the nut out, washer likes to stick there, so I put my thumb on it, keep it there until I got the diaphragm out. And then the reverse is the same. So those two little protrusions, they fit in these two notches here. We'll line that up. And you could pull this magnet out. It's easy to shuttle it back and forth. So to make installing the diaphragm easier, I usually pull it out so it's at its farthest extent. So it's quite easy then to wind the little nut back on. Turning it on its side. Tighten that. Chamber block. Line everything up. And hold it and install the screws. If you're rebuilding this pump, there's a good chance that the auto stop switch tripped. So I'll show you how to reset that as well as part of this process when we're done here. So I've put all 4 screws in. I'm going to give them one last turn. And the only thing we've got left to do now is to replace the wires in their respective notches. So the neutral goes on the side, clips in, top of the chamber block clips in, the power wire clips into its notch, and that's it. That pump is rebuilt. Doesn't take very long. And so on top of this pump, I don't know if you can see this, but there's a little switch there with an arrow on it. And when one of these diaphragms tears, this switch will trip and turn the power off to the pump. And it sits sideways like that once it's tripped. And you see the other arrow there. You need to line those two arrows up in order to reset this auto stop switch. So you pull this out. It's a little U-shaped device. And you put it in at an angle like that. And then you push it straight down. And it kind of clicks into place. And when it's in there properly, it doesn't move. If you just take the switch after it's tripped and you turn it, it looks okay, but it's very loose in there. And that will not make the electrical connection, so the pump won't turn on. So you need to take it off, put it in at an angle, push it down, and it's good to go. So now we can put the housing back on. So when you look at this housing, there's a little notch on the housing, and that has to correspond with the electrical cable, the power cable. If you put it on backwards, it will fit. Be a bit loose on there, it rocks, and but you can tighten it down just fine. But what you'll find is when you fire this pump up, it won't produce much air, and it'll make a hell of a racket. So line the notch up with the electrical cable. So we put our 4 bolts back in, securing the housing to the base of the pump. Thread them down with a screwdriver. And then I'll give them a final turn with my wrench to make sure they're secure. I'm going to do this in an X pattern, same way I did the chamber blocks. Filter back on, new one if you've replaced it. And the air filter cover has a sign on it with an arrow. And that arrow must point to the outlet neck of the pump. It kind of drops into its little happy place. There. Wind the screw down until it's secure. And you're done. It's ready to go.